The room was silent except for the scratch of a fountain pen on paper. Outside, rain drummed against the blacked-out windows of a nondescript office building in neutral Bern, Switzerland. It was February 1945, and across Europe the war still raged with merciless fury. But here, in this shadowed room, an American intelligence officer named Allen Dulles sat across from a man who could change everything. A high-ranking Nazi general willing to betray Hitler himself. One wrong word, one misstep, and not only would this meeting end in disaster, but hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers preparing for the final push into Germany could walk straight into a trap. The stakes couldn't be higher. This wasn't a battlefield where courage could be measured in gunfire and blood. This was a different kind of war, one fought in whispers, coded messages, and the cold calculation of trust between enemies. If this story already has you hooked, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Allen Dulles wasn't your typical American hero. He didn't wear a uniform covered in medals. He didn't command troops or fly bombers over enemy territory. But in the shadowy world of wartime intelligence, Dulles was a giant. As the Office of Strategic Services Station Chief in Switzerland, he operated in one of the last neutral territories in Europe, a place where spies from every nation crossed paths, where information was currency, and where a single conversation could save or doom thousands. Dulles had spent years cultivating sources, building networks, and waiting for the opportunity that would justify every risk he'd taken. That opportunity arrived in the form of a message so explosive it seemed almost too good to be true. The message came through an intermediary, a Swiss businessman with connections on both sides of the war. It claimed that SS General Karl Wolff, one of Heinrich Himmler's most trusted officers and the highest-ranking SS commander in Italy, wanted to make contact with the Americans. Wolff wasn't just any Nazi officer. He commanded hundreds of thousands of German and Italian fascist troops holding a defensive line across northern Italy. If those forces fought to the last man, as Hitler demanded, the Allied advance would become a bloodbath. But Wolff was proposing something unthinkable, a separate surrender of all German forces in Italy, effectively opening the door for Allied troops to sweep into southern Germany and Austria without firing a shot. It would cut weeks, maybe months off the war. It would save countless American lives. But it could also be the most elaborate trap ever conceived. Dulles knew the risks. The Gestapo had agents everywhere, even in neutral Switzerland. One leak and Wolff would be executed, along with everyone involved in the negotiations. Worse, if Hitler discovered that one of his top generals was negotiating surrender, he might order a scorched earth policy across Italy, blowing up dams, destroying cities, massacring civilians as punishment. And, if this was a deception, if Wolff was baiting the Allies into revealing their invasion plans or sowing distrust between America and its Soviet allies, the consequences would be catastrophic. But Dulles also understood something fundamental about war in early 1945. Germany was finished, and the Nazis knew it. The question wasn't whether Germany would lose, but how much blood would be spilled before the end came. Dulles sent back a carefully worded response. He would meet with Wolff's representatives, but only if they could prove the general's sincerity. The first meeting took place in early March, in a safe house in the Swiss town of Lugano. Wolff sent two envoys, an Italian baron and an SS colonel. Dulles brought his top deputy and an American general who would assess the military value of any proposed surrender. The atmosphere was electric with tension. These men had been trying to kill each other's countrymen for years, and now they sat around a table, sipping coffee, discussing how to end the war. The SS colonel was blunt. General Wolff, he explained, had no love for Hitler's scorched earth fanaticism. The war is lost. Continuing to fight would only result in the destruction of Italy and the pointless deaths of German soldiers who could otherwise return home to rebuild their shattered country. Wolfe wanted to negotiate a surrender that would preserve what was left of Italy and spare his men from a suicidal last stand. Dulles listened carefully, asking pointed questions. What guarantees could Wolfe provide? Could he act independently, or would he need approval from Berlin? What about other German commanders in Italy? Would they follow Wolfe's lead, or would some resist? The SS colonel had answers for everything, but Dulles remained cautious. He'd been in the intelligence game long enough to know that sincerity and deception often wore the same face. He told the envoys he would consider their proposal, but he needed to meet with Wolfe directly. No intermediaries. No more coded messages. If the general was serious about ending the bloodshed, he would have to risk coming to Switzerland himself. Would you have made the same choice? Would you sit across from an SS general knowing that he'd served one of the most evil regimes in history and gamble that his desire for survival outweighed his loyalty to Hitler? On March 8, 1945, Karl Wolfe crossed the Swiss border in secret. He wore civilian clothes and carried false identification. If the Gestapo discovered his absence, he'd be shot for treason. If the meeting went wrong, he could be arrested by the Swiss or killed by Allied agents who had no patience for negotiating with Nazis. But Wolfe came anyway, because he understood that his only chance of surviving the war, and perhaps salvaging some small piece of honor from the wreckage of the Third Reich, lay in this desperate gamble. He met Dulles in a villa outside Bern, and for hours the two men talked. Dulles was struck by Wolfe's composure. This wasn't a broken man begging for mercy. Wolfe spoke with the precision of a career military officer, laying out the strategic situation in Italy with brutal honesty. The German defensive line, he explained, was still formidable. His troops were dug into the mountains and prepared to fight. But there was no possibility of victory. Every day the war continued meant more destruction, more death, and more reason for the Allies to seek vengeance when it was over. Wolfe argued that a negotiated surrender would benefit everyone. The Allies would gain control of northern Italy without a costly offensive, the Italian people would be spared further devastation, and the German soldiers under his command would be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention rather than hunted down as war criminals. Dulles pressed him on the hardest question. Why should America trust an SS general? Wolfe's answer was chillingly pragmatic. He didn't ask to be trusted. He asked to be believed when he said that Germany had lost, and that prolonging the war served no one's interest, least of all his own. He had no illusions about his future. He knew that his service to the Nazi regime would have consequences. But he could choose how the end came. He could follow Hitler's orders and watch Italy burn, or he could act independently and give the Allies what they needed most: a swift, clean end to the Italian campaign. Dulles reported back to Washington, and the response was swift but cautious. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, just weeks away from his death, approved the negotiations, codenamed Operation Sunrise. But he also issued stern warnings. No deals that would undermine the unconditional surrender policy agreed upon by the Allies, and no actions that would give the Soviet Union any reason to suspect America was making a separate peace with Germany. The Soviets were already paranoid about Western intentions, and any hint that the U.S. was negotiating behind their backs could shatter the alliance just when it was needed most. Dulles was walking a tightrope, balancing military necessity, political diplomacy, and the ever-present danger that the entire operation could collapse at any moment. The negotiations dragged on for weeks, conducted in secret and under constant threat of discovery. Wolfe returned to Italy and began quietly preparing his commanders for surrender. But he couldn't move too quickly. Other German officers, fanatically loyal to Hitler, would resist any attempt to lay down arms. The Gestapo was still active, still executing anyone suspected of defeatism. And Hitler himself, isolated in his Berlin bunker, was issuing increasingly deranged orders for the destruction of Germany's infrastructure rather than let it fall into Allied hands. Wolf had to maneuver carefully, building support among his subordinates while avoiding detection by Nazi hardliners who would see surrender as treason. Meanwhile, Dulles faced obstacles of his own. The Soviet Union, upon learning of the negotiations through intelligence leaks, erupted in fury. Stalin accused the Western Allies of plotting a separate peace that would allow Germany to shift forces eastward for a final stand against the Red Army. The accusations were baseless, but they created a diplomatic crisis that nearly derailed Operation Sunrise. President Roosevelt personally reassured Stalin that no separate peace was being negotiated, only a local military surrender in Italy. But the damage was done. Trust between the Allies, already fragile, had been strained to the breaking point. Every 4 minutes of this unfolding drama must have felt like an eternity. Imagine being Dulles, knowing that any leak, any miscommunication, any betrayal could result not only in the failure of the operation, but in a deepening rift between America and the Soviet Union at the worst possible moment. Was this bravery or madness? By late April 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing. Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin. American and British armies were sweeping across Germany. The Nazi regime was in its death throes. But in Italy, Wolf's forces still held their defensive positions, and the potential for a bloody final battle remained real. Dulles and Wolf exchanged frantic messages. The time had come. If Wolf was going to act, it had to be now, before Hitler's final orders reached Italy, before the Gestapo could intervene, before the entire operation unraveled. On April 29, 1945, German forces in Italy received the order: cease hostilities and prepare to surrender. The announcement sent shockwaves through both sides. Nazi hardliners refused to believe it. Some German units ignored the order and continued fighting. But Wolf had prepared his commanders well, and the majority complied. Within days, nearly 1 million German and Italian fascist troops laid down their arms. The surrender, formalized on May 2, 1945, was the first major German capitulation of the war. It came 6 days before the unconditional surrender of all German forces on May 8, known as VE Day. The impact was staggering. The Italian campaign, which had dragged on for nearly 2 years and cost tens of thousands of Allied lives, ended not with a climactic battle, but with a negotiated peace brokered by an American intelligence officer and a Nazi general who chose survival over fanaticism. Allied forces swept into northern Italy and southern Austria virtually unopposed. Supply lines that would have been needed for a costly offensive were freed up for other operations. Most importantly, American soldiers who would have died in the final push through the Alps went home to their families. Could anyone else have pulled this off? Could any other intelligence officer have navigated the minefield of military strategy, political intrigue, and moral ambiguity that defined Operation Sunrise? Allen Dulles believed in the power of negotiation, in the idea that even in the darkest moments of war, rational self-interest could triumph over ideology. He gambled that Karl Wolff, despite his service to one of history's most monstrous regimes, valued his own survival and the survival of his men more than loyalty to a dying Führer. And he was right. But the story doesn't end with the surrender. Wolff, true to Dulles's predictions, faced consequences for his role in the Nazi regime. He was tried for war crimes, not for his actions in Italy, but for his earlier role in the Holocaust as Himmler's chief of staff. He served time in prison, was released, and lived in relative obscurity until his death in 1984. Dulles, on the other hand, went on to become one of the most powerful figures in American intelligence. He later served as the director of the Central Intelligence Agency during the Cold War, shaping U.S. covert operations for decades. But Operation Sunrise remained one of his proudest achievements, a mission where patience, cunning, and a willingness to negotiate with the enemy saved thousands of American lives. The secret meeting in Bern wasn't a dramatic firefight or a heroic charge. It was a quiet, calculated act of courage that changed the course of history. It demonstrated that American strength isn't just found on the battlefield. It's found in the intelligence, resourcefulness, and moral clarity of individuals willing to take extraordinary risks for the greater good. Dulles didn't fire a shot, but his actions in those tense weeks of early 1945 shortened the war, saved lives, and reaffirmed the idea that even in the chaos of global conflict, Americans could outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast their enemies. These stories remind us why courage matters, and why freedom was never free. Subscribe now and join us again for more untold tales of WW2.